On the night of April 14th, 1912, the great ocean liner, RMS Titanic, was carrying thousands of passengers across the Atlantic Ocean. Subscribe for more historic stories. While most people remember the grand staircase, the luxury cabins, and the wealthy passengers on board, there was another important part of the ship that rarely receives attention. The mailroom. Deep inside the Titanic, far below the elegant decks and crowded promenades, a team of dedicated postal workers was responsible for handling thousands of letters and packages that were being transported across the ocean. At the time, the Titanic was not just a passenger ship, it was also a floating post office. Officially known as a sea post office, the mailroom carried an enormous amount of mail between Europe and the United States. On that voyage alone, the ship carried more than 3,000 bags of letters and parcels. These letters contained personal messages, business documents, family news, and hopes from people on both sides of the Atlantic. The men working in the mailroom were not ordinary crew members. They were trained postal clerks assigned by government postal services. Their job was to sort mail while the ship traveled, ensuring that once the Titanic arrived in New York, the letters could immediately enter the American postal system. This process saved valuable time and helped businesses and families receive important communication faster. The mailroom was located on one of the lower decks of the Titanic, close to the cargo holds. It was not a glamorous place like the first-class lounges or dining halls. Instead, it was a busy working space filled with heavy mailbags stacked in rows. Clerks worked the long hours, sorting letters, stamping documents, and organizing packages according to destination. On board that night were several postal workers, including dedicated men such as John Reacher, Yago Smith, and Oscar Scott Woody. Their responsibility was enormous. Thousands of letters depended on their work, and they took their duties seriously. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., most passengers were unaware of what had happened. The impact was not strong enough to cause immediate panic. However, below deck, water had already begun entering several compartments of the ship. Unfortunately, the mailroom was located in one of the lower sections, where flooding started early. As water slowly began to enter the lower decks, the postal clerks quickly realized the danger. Instead of immediately abandoning their work, they attempted to save as much mail as possible. Historical accounts suggest that the clerks tried to move mailbags to higher areas to protect them from the rising water. Their dedication showed how seriously they took their responsibilities. Imagine the scene inside the mailroom during those moments. Water slowly creeping across the floor. Heavy sacks of letters piled high around the room. Postal clerks rushing to lift and move them while the ship's fate remained uncertain. They understood that the letters represented the voices and hopes of thousands of people. Some letters contained business agreements worth large amounts of money. Others carried personal messages between loved ones, separated by an ocean. Many immigrants had written letters to relatives waiting in America, sharing their excitement about arriving soon. Losing those letters meant losing pieces of people's lives. Despite their efforts, the situation quickly became impossible. The flooding accelerated as the Titanic's compartments filled with icy seawater. Eventually, the postal workers had no choice but to abandon the mailroom and attempt to escape. Tragically, none of the postal clerks on the Titanic survived the disaster. All 5 men working in the sea post office lost their lives that night. Their dedication and bravery were later recognized by both British and American postal authorities. When the ship finally sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15th, thousands of mailbags disappeared beneath the ocean along with the ship. It is estimated that more than 7 million pieces of mail were lost in the disaster. Business documents, love letters, personal notes, and family messages all vanished into the dark waters of the North Atlantic. Days later, when the rescue ship RMS Carpathia arrived in New York carrying Titanic survivors, investigators began piecing together the story of what had happened. Among the many tragic discoveries was the loss of the entire sea post office staff. Governments in both the United States and Britain praised the postal clerks for their bravery and commitment to duty. Their attempt to save the mail, even as the ship was sinking, became a powerful example of dedication and responsibility. In the years following the disaster, the Titanic's mail story became an important part of maritime and postal history. Some historians consider the Titanic one of the largest postal losses in history because of the enormous number of letters that were destroyed. Today, collectors and historians still study the rare surviving pieces of mail connected to the Titanic voyage. A few letters that had been posted before the ship sailed or transferred earlier in the journey survived, and later became valuable historical artifacts. The story of the Titanic's mailroom reminds us that the ship was more than a luxury liner. It was a complex system carrying passengers, cargo, dreams, and communication between continents. While passengers fought for survival on the decks above, postal workers below are trying to protect the messages of thousands of strangers. Their sacrifice is often overlooked when people discuss the Titanic disaster. Yet their story represents something deeply human. The idea that even in the face of danger, people sometimes choose to fulfill their duties and responsibilities. More than a century later, the wreck of the Titanic still rests on the ocean floor, nearly 4 kilometers beneath the surface. Somewhere within that wreckage lie the remains of countless letters that were never delivered. Messages of love, hope, business, and family connection remain sealed forever in the dark Atlantic waters. The mailroom of the Titanic may not have been glamorous, but its story is one of dedication, sacrifice, and tragedy. The clerks who worked there were ordinary men performing an important job, and their actions during the disaster ensured that they would be remembered as quiet heroes of the Titanic story. Their efforts show that even during one of the greatest maritime tragedies in history, people continued trying to protect the connections between families, businesses, and loved ones across the world. And although those letters were never delivered, the story of the men who tried to save them continues to travel through history, reminding us that behind every disaster are individuals whose courage deserves to be remembered.